1970s was a golden age of rock music, but behind the thunderous applause and dazzling lights, many legends fell into darkness. Fame didn't just lift them up, it consumed them, leaving scars that could never heal. Some of the most brilliant artists of the decade spiraled into madness, losing control of their minds, their careers, and ultimately their lives. This is not just a story about music, it's a story about how fragile greatness can be. The higher they climbed, the harder they fell. Today, we count down the 10 rock legends who went insane and lost everything in the 1970s. 10. Syd Barrett, the fallen visionary. Syd Barrett was the founding genius behind Pink Floyd, the man who gave the band its psychedelic soul. His imagination was boundless, painting soundscapes that redefined what rock could be. But as the 1970s unfolded, his brilliance began to fracture into chaos. On stage, he often froze, staring blankly while the music carried on without him. His guitar would hang silent in his hands, a symbol of a mind slipping away. LSD, which had once fueled his creativity, became his undoing. Trips that began as moments of inspiration turned into endless spirals of paranoia. His bandmates tried to hold on, but the man they loved was disappearing before their eyes. Barrett's decline was swift and irreversible. By the mid-70s, he was gone from music completely, retreating into a life of isolation. The visionary who had once stood at the center of London's psychedelic explosion lost everything: his career, his sanity, and his place in the very movement he had created. 9. Peter Green, the blues legend who vanished. Peter Green, the original leader of Fleetwood Mac, was more than a guitarist. He was a force of nature. His playing carried fire and soul, earning him comparisons to Clapton and Hendrix. At the end of the 60s, he seemed destined for eternal greatness. But the 1970s brought a storm that he could not escape. Green grew obsessed with spirituality, convinced that fame and fortune were curses, not blessings. LSD worsened his paranoia, twisting his worldview until he seemed lost in a maze of delusion. Friends watched helplessly as he drifted further away from the man he once was. By the early 70s, he had walked away from Fleetwood Mac and disappeared into obscurity. The once celebrated guitar hero lived in poverty, in and out of psychiatric care, his legend fading into whispers. For someone who had the talent to conquer the world, Peter Green lost everything to the shadows of his own mind. 8. Roky Erickson, the psychedelic casualty. Roky Erickson, frontman of the 13th Floor Elevators, was one of the first true pioneers of psychedelic rock. His voice, raw and electrifying, captured the chaos of an era. But the 1970s would not be kind to him. After being arrested for drug possession, Erickson chose to enter a mental hospital rather than face prison. It was a decision that altered his life forever. There, he was subjected to electroshock therapy, treatments that left him scarred and fragmented. His songs turned surreal, filled with visions of aliens and demons, reflections of a mind unraveling. By the end of the decade, Erickson had slipped far from reality. He lived in isolation, scribbling songs that few ever heard. Once a prophet of psychedelic freedom, he became a tragic reminder of how that same freedom could consume those who embraced it too deeply. 7. Brian Wilson, the broken genius. Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys was not just a musician, he was a visionary who redefined pop music. Pet Sounds remains a masterpiece, proof of his genius. Yet as the 70s wore on, Wilson became trapped inside his own mind. Paranoia, depression, and substance abuse weighed heavily on him. He withdrew from the public eye, spending months at a time in his bedroom, isolated from the world. His family and bandmates looked on in despair as the man who once filled the air with harmony fell silent. Though the Beach Boys continued to tour and record, Wilson himself was drifting further away. The decade that could have been his triumph became his downfall. His story showed the world that even the brightest genius could be broken by the pressures of fame and the torment of mental illness. 6. Jim Gordon, the drummer who lost control. Jim Gordon was one of the most in-demand drummers of his era. He played with Derek and the Dominos and even co-wrote the haunting piano coda of Layla. His talent was undeniable, but inside, he was fighting a war no one could see. Gordon suffered from schizophrenia, though it went undiagnosed for years. He heard voices that tormented him, pushing him to the edge of sanity. Friends noticed his erratic behavior, but few realized just how deep his suffering ran. By the late 70s, his mental health had deteriorated beyond repair. And though the most shocking tragedy, when he murdered his mother, came later, the seeds of his collapse were planted in this decade. Gordon was proof that even at the height of musical success, a mind at war with itself could destroy everything. 5. Brian Jones, the Stone Who Slipped Away. Brian Jones, founding member of the Rolling Stones, was the restless spirit who gave the band its edge. His mastery of multiple instruments helped shape their earliest sound, and his rebellious energy set them apart. But by the dawn of the 70s, he was a man unraveling. Drugs, alcohol, and personal struggles consumed him. He grew distant from the band, missing sessions, unable to keep pace with their relentless rise. His isolation deepened, and tensions with the other Stones grew unbearable. In July 1969, Jones was found dead in his swimming pool at only 27 years old. Though his death came just as the 70s began, his downfall symbolized the dangers that would haunt so many rock stars throughout the decade. He had it all, but in the end, he lost his place in music and his life. 4. Elvis Presley, the King Who Fell. Elvis Presley was the king of rock and roll, a living legend whose voice and charisma shaped an entire generation. But in the 1970s, the crown grew heavy. His concerts in Las Vegas dazzled audiences, but backstage, he was crumbling. Addiction to prescription drugs took hold. His once slim frame bloated, his health declined, and his performances grew erratic. Surrounded by an entourage that enabled rather than helped him, Elvis became trapped in a cycle he couldn't escape. In August 1977, Elvis died at Graceland, only 42 years old. The world mourned the king, but also saw the cost of fame and excess. His final years were not a celebration, but a slow-motion collapse. The king had lost his throne, his power, and ultimately his life. 3. Sid Vicious, the punk tragedy. Sid Vicious, bassist of the Sex Pistols, embodied the raw chaos of punk. He was young, wild, and reckless, the face of rebellion in a disillusioned Britain. But rebellion came at a price he couldn't pay. Sid became deeply addicted to heroin. His relationship with Nancy Spungen was volatile and destructive, a love story written in violence and despair. In 1978, when Nancy was found stabbed to death, suspicion fell directly on Sid. His world spiraled further into chaos. Just months later, Sid died of a heroin overdose at only 21 years old. He became the ultimate symbol of punk's destructive energy, a legend who burned out before he ever truly had the chance to shine. His story was as short as it was tragic. 2. Keith Moon, the madman behind the drums. Keith Moon, the legendary drummer of The Who, was chaos personified. On stage, he was a whirlwind, beating his drums with a ferocity that thrilled millions. Off stage, his life was a blur of destruction and excess. Moon was infamous for his wild antics, smashing hotel rooms, reckless pranks, and endless partying. His dependence on alcohol and drugs only fueled his unpredictability, leaving even his closest friends worried for his safety. By the late 70s, Moon's body and mind could no longer keep up with the madness. He died in 1978 at just 32 years old, a tragic end for one of rock's most electrifying performers. His fall was proof that even boundless energy could burn out too soon. 1. Jim Morrison, the Lizard King who lost himself. Jim Morrison of The Doors was more than a rock star. He was a poet, a prophet, and a symbol of rebellion. His deep voice and hypnotic stage presence made him a cultural icon. But the very fame that elevated him also destroyed him. Morrison drowned himself in alcohol and drugs, using them to escape the crushing weight of expectation. His performances grew erratic, his legal troubles mounted, and his mind slipped further into chaos. The Lizard King was losing control of the kingdom he had built. In 1971, Morrison was found dead in Paris at just 27 years old. He became a member of the infamous 27 Club, leaving behind a legacy of brilliance overshadowed by tragedy. The man who seemed untouchable had lost it all: his career, his future, and his life.